session, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to people. I know we have people from all over the world. My name is David Ellen. I'm going to go ahead and let everybody see each other for a minute. My name is David Ellen. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm delighted to be joined by my friends Bethia Haskell and Jen Griffin, both hail from Austin, Texas. So together, I don't want to date us at all, but together we all have about 80 years of combined customer success experience. So we bring a little bit of knowledge to the table. And I do want to share that today is a very, very big birthday for Beth. I won't say the number of years. All I'll tell you is it ends in a 0. So that's pretty big. So what I'd like everybody to do is go to chat, and in chat, just wish Beth a happy birthday from whatever city or country you're dialing in from.
Aw, I like that approach. That way we get to see where everybody is.
I know, that's why I was going to have everyone come off mute and sing happy birthday, but
no.
expansion's a more important topic.
All right, Munich, New York, Toronto.
Oh, and somebody else from Austin.
Hey, Austin representing.
Nice.
Yeah,
Ooh, Macedonia.
New York City.
That's awesome.
Okay, so while you're doing that, I do want to share a couple of housekeeping things. So the first one is that during the session, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We're going to leave the chat open. There's 3 of us, so we're going to be monitoring the chat and answering any questions that you might have during the chat session. So we'll leave it on, and there's going to be plenty of time at the end of the session for us to do some Q&A as well. So if we don't get to your question either in the chat session or we bring it up during the session as an interactive question, we'll try to get to it at the end. And if we miss it, just come off mute and remind us. So we are revenue architects with Winning by Design, and we're all very pleased to be involved very much so in the customer success community and being able to help and bring some thought leadership to the market today. So the things that we're going to cover is we're going to talk about what expansion is. We'll actually come up with a definition. Who owns expansion? One of the hottest topics in customer success today. How we identify expansion opportunities, what we should try to do to improve our expansion opportunities, and what skills we might need to look at for expansion. So let's jump right in and let's start with expansion. So we're going to talk about a definition. There are really 4 different categories of expansion. We'll talk a little bit about those, and then we'll get into some metrics at a very high level. So let's start with the definition of expansion. So expansion is nothing more than growth in revenue from existing accounts beyond their initial contract value. So you may have a land and expand motion, you may have a land large and then expand small later on motion. That's all fine. But all we're really talking about here is the additional revenue growth you're going to get from your existing customers. And there are really 4 different categories. There's renewals, which is really selling the same thing to the same people for more time. There's upsells, which is creating more impact for an existing customer through more seats, features, or products. There's cross-selling, which tends to be the most complicated type of expansion, and that's creating new impact for a new team and an existing customer. It might be a new department, it might be a new region, something like that. And then there's resell, which really can create impact everywhere within a customer's company. So let's talk about metrics a little bit. We'll start with the difference between gross revenue retention and net revenue retention. This might be a common knowledge thing for some. I know for others, sometimes they confuse them. So gross revenue retention takes your starting ARR for a period of time. That could be a month, a year, whatever, a quarter, whatever it happens to be. It subtracts your churn and contraction, And that's your ending GRR for that period of time. NRR is similar, except that it includes expansion revenue, all of the new revenue that you're getting from existing customers. So NRR is really becoming the North Star for most SaaS companies today. It's really the number that everybody is starting to focus on. Hasn't really been that case in the past, but is becoming so today. And it doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that NRR is the only metric you should look at, but it is becoming the most important metric. So now let's talk about who owns expansion. So as I mentioned before, this is truly one of the hottest debates in SaaS right now. And before we actually get into who owns it, we're going to do a survey with you. What we'd like to do is we're going to pop up 2 questions on here. The first question is, who owns expansion in your organization today? And you've got a couple of choices. It's a single choice answer. So it could be the account executive who's responsible for new logo and expansion, the AE who's responsible for new logo and or renewal, the account manager, a customer success manager, or someone else in the organization. The second question is, are you satisfied with your expansion process today? We didn't want to take the time to ask if you had a process defined. If you don't have a process defined, then you're probably not happy with it. And let's give it a second, and then when we stop seeing responses come in, we'll take a quick look.
I like Sydney's comment here that it's single choice to make it simpler than reality. And I think that's true for a lot of us, right? It's mixed. A bunch of people own it. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that.
All right.
Okay, we're at 50%. Very interesting that not yet do we see anybody that has an AE that handles new logo sales and expansion.
It's also interesting that nobody has said yes to, are you satisfied with your expansion process today? There's room to improve for sure.
Okay,
Right.
so we're at 56%. Looks like we've got our answers in. So
Right.
we've got customer success managers and account managers are tied, and then we've got AEs, and then which is probably in some companies just another title for account manager, and then none on the new logo side. So I'm very, very impressed by that. And then for the second question, we've got nobody is satisfied. Wow. Okay, nice to see that people are making changes.
Awesome.
Okay.
Perfect.
Very good. Okay, so let's talk about who really owns expansion. So from an expansion situation, expansion responsibilities often move from one role to another, right? Companies never seem to be satisfied with who's doing it, what their RACI model looks like, who's responsible, who's accountable, and it shifts around a lot. There are a lot of pros and cons for each role. None of the roles are perfect that you can pick. There's always some pros and cons to each one. And the key is collaboration between people. But the truth is, it really doesn't matter who owns expansion. What really matters is that you have the right support structure, the right process, the right skills. So let's dig into that just a little bit. So from an expansion perspective, what we want to understand is, does the person that owns expansion have the time to give it adequate attention? Right? If they're an account manager and they also own renewals and expansions for about a book of business of 250 accounts, they're probably not giving expansion adequate time. You know, if somebody has competing KPIs, let's say you do have an AE that owns new logo sales and expansion, and they have an extremely high quota for new logo sales, they're probably not paying the right amount of attention to expansion, and it's likely suffering. And on the skills level, do they have the skills to effectively drive expansion to a successful close? If they don't understand how to run an effective discovery meeting, if they're not likely to keep track of all of the steps that they're doing, or there are multiple people that are competing for leading the expansion process, then likely there's work that's falling through the cracks, and the team might look disjointed to your customer. So all of these are considerations that when you factor in who should be owning it, you want to make sure that whoever it is, you're setting them up for success with the right KPIs, with the right amount of bandwidth, and certainly with the right amount of skills, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jen and let Jen take over from here.
Awesome. So while it doesn't necessarily matter who technically owns it, the big question is, how do you identify it? And this is all going to start with impact, one word, and we're going to dive into what we mean when we say impact. So if you have ever had a conversation or been to a seminar or session with our founder, Jaco, you have certainly heard his line of recurring revenue is a result of recurring impact. And when I first came to Winning by Design, I thought, yes, this is what I've tried to say for years as a CS person, but not as eloquently, right? It's so simple. You want recurring impact, you have to have a recurring revenue, you have to have that recurring impact, right? It is just that simple. But where it gets a little more complicated is impact. What do we mean when we say impact? So what most people think of are the numbers. Save time, save money, increase revenue. I think everyone in CS land, it's what's my ROI model, right? Because we want a math problem, right? They're spending $50,000. If I can show $70,000 of impact, my job is easy, right? And that is certainly true, but there is another side of the coin. There is the emotional impact as well. And this is something that at Winning by Design, we harp on a lot because it really is split in two, right? There really are two halves of this. So while I would love to say you never have to worry about an ROI model again, that's not what we're saying, right? That's important. That's going to satisfy that rational itch, but there's also this emotional side. And when we look at emotional, what do we mean? So emotional impact will tend to benefit the person first and then the company. So I'll give you an example, right? If I'm someone who I have to make a manual report every week and my boss wants it first thing on Monday morning, and it takes me 2.5 hours to run. And oh, by the way, I can't actually run it until after Friday at 5 p.m. until all the data's in. I'm giving it my weekends to run it, right? Am I the only one who's done this before? So this is something that people have, right? And they come to you and they say, man, your tool, it will take all this away. This is amazing. It'll help me so much. I'll get my life back. I can have dinner with my kids. I can do all these things. And yeah, it'll benefit the company, right? It'll get, some faster reporting out there. That's emotional impact. Now, when I try to go and convince my boss to do this, I'm going to start talking rational, right? I'm going to start bringing in all those dollar savings to justify it. And emotional impact can vary from person to person, right? For this same software, it might be for me, I want my time back and your product can help it. For someone else, it might be, I really want to look awesome presenting my data in a very clean and concise way, because maybe I'm gunning for a promotion, right? And that's something that's going to drive me. So you really have to kind of figure out like what drives a person on that emotional side as they get to it. And the reason it's important to look at both the rational and the emotional is because human beings are wired to think this way. And most of us, there's some of us who this don't fall into, but most of us make emotional decisions. And this is true in real life as it is in software. So when I'm out, I was just shopping for a new dress to wear to my daughter's graduation, and you go in and I found a great dress and it looked amazing on me. And I was like, this is it. Then I looked at the price tag and I was like, God, that is hard to justify, right? For that one-time wear. And that's when the rationalizing starts coming in, right? Oh, I can actually wear it 2 other times, right? Or whatever. And sometimes the price tag is too much, right? The rational is going to overweigh and I'm not going to get the dress. Other times I can squint, right? And I can make all the things I need to get to it, right? Or summer is coming and I'm on a diet and I really want that cake. It's so good and it's moist and it's homemade. Now the rational starts, right? Well, I did work out this morning and I'm definitely going to work out tonight. So let's do it, right? And so we're wired this way to look at our decisions and our emotions are what's going to drive us there. And then we're going to seek that rational side, which is why you have to talk about it on both ends, right? So when we're talking to our customers, how do we get there? And we try to teach people in our courses to get there layer by layer, right? So we want to start at the very top, the situation. What are we walking into, right? These tend to be closed-ended questions that you can ask, right? How many people are using the tool? How many hours is this taking you to run? How many times a week are you doing this, right? Get the facts, nothing but the facts. Understand the situation. Then you dig one deeper, right? You start looking at the pain and trying to get them to articulate it and then empathize, right? Sit there with it for, wow, you have to do this report every single week manually. It takes you how long? That stinks. You're giving up your weekend. I used to have to do that. Man, that really stinks, right? Get them to feel that pain, acknowledge that pain. And then the third step is that impact. And I'll tell you, most people skip the impact question. Why? Because it sounds cheesy in real life. And because most of us assume that it's obvious, right? If I'm talking to you about the software that's going to automate reports and you're talking about how painful not having automated reports are, it doesn't take much to connect the dots that my software is going to help you, right? But there is power in getting someone to articulate it, right? So after you sit there in the pain and you empathize, and man, that stinks, you pause and you ask that question, what would it mean if you never had to run that report again? And then you pause and you let them articulate it. And it sounds really corny at first, but getting them to say it now starts locking it, right? And you're doing some magic in their brain where you're linking to them like, wow, this really is a cool software. This is a cool thing that's going to go in and change my day-to-day work, right? So if I am a CS leader and I have my team coming to me and they say, hey boss, it's the beginning of the quarter, and I know you told me I had to find $50,000 in expansion. I know what I'm going to do. I found my 5 accounts. I'm going to go after them hard. I can do it. Your first question should be to ask them, that's awesome. What impact have we driven for those accounts? And if they don't know this answer, send them back. There's more work to be done, right? And so this is an example here. Don't get married to 5 on each side. Sometimes you'll have 2 and 3 or whatever, but really think about it. Ideally, you're documenting this somewhere in your CRM or your CS tools, but even just asking the questions, right? To say, that's awesome. What have we done for them on both sides? And if they can't answer things like, oh yes, I know, we totally have saved them $20,000 and my champion just got a raise and she's been touting us and she is so happy because we've gotten her all this time back. She's done 2 case studies with us so far and, right? What is that story? And if you don't have that, then that's where we need to kind of go through and get to the next piece of it. So we will, before I shift over to Beth, one of the things to talk about is, this is all about expansion. So we're harping on impact as an expansion moment. But I think everybody on this line, anyone who's been in the CS world at all, knows we do not start talking about impact 2 weeks before a renewal and hope that we are going to magically get an expansion. And we at Winning by Design say we have to actually start it all the way on the left-hand side of that bow tie, right? In that sales side of the funnel, so that we don't even know what impact they're looking for when they start. And it's up to our selling team to dig, use some of those same question techniques, discover that impact, help them prioritize. Wow, which thing is the most important, so that I, as a salesperson, can sell you the right package, right? To get you the right impact. And then I, as a buyer, am going to buy on the promise of this impact, right? Sales is going to promise us impact. We're going to get through implementation, and it's up to us in CS to start delivering on that impact. And we want to get them through that onboarding. We want to get them to that first impact. And then we want to have impact after impact after impact, so that then we get to that expansion piece for it. And you'll note there, I've got first impact is highlighted. And this is because this one is the one that tends to get overlooked a lot. I think every customer we've ever worked with Winning by Design, they either don't even know what this first impact is, or they're not measuring it. And I'm not going to go too deeply in here because we could do an entire 45-minute session on just first impact. But suffice it to say, you need to determine what it is. And this might vary from customer to customer. They bought you for a reason. Does your onboarding team know? Why are they buying it? What are they looking? What pain point am I looking to go and get? And hint, first impact is not they've downloaded your software, right? What pain point have we addressed and have we had impact for it? Know what that time is, measure it, work to reduce it, and then celebrate when you hit it. That's awesome. You came to us because that report, it's gone. It's off of your plate forever. Hallelujah. What next? Like, what's the next thing I can do for you? Is there another pain point? Go back to my questions. Can I dig down and find another pain point? Or is there someone else in the organization who has a similar pain point? Can you introduce us, right? So by using this technique, you're kind of digging along, and you're going to, if nothing else, drive your adoption, and then hopefully identify areas. Are there places we can sell you new features, sell you new upgrades, introduce to a new team, et cetera, as they go through all along this journey. So that's a little bit about impact along the bow tie there. And we're now going to, I'll turn it over to Beth, and we're going to get tactical on why you're here, right? What can I do to actually drive my expansions and make them a bit better?
Excellent. And one comment I want to make before we go into this, can you go back one slide, Jen, real quick? I just want to point out, when you look at the bow tie and you see on the right side those gray arrows that go around in a loop, recurring revenue is the result of recurring impact. We're not going to go really deep into the math of it all, but what's so important about expansion too are really two things. One is that it's going to be rare that you can profit off of one contract cycle with a client. So just as you're working towards getting your company to profitability, the longer and the more dollars you can get from an account, the faster you can get there. So just when we think on the surface of why expansion is so important, that's really big. The other thing is that you can take advantage of compound growth every time you have a higher dollar amount on a contract cycle. So our revenue architecture course can go deep into this, but just math-wise, making sure expansion is on the radar is huge to get a company towards profitability. So I just wanted to comment on that part. So let's get into the tactics. All right. So it's one thing to know why expansion is important, but it's a different thing to actually do it. So you really need to take into consideration in your present org what you have in place, what's working, and where there are gaps. So I know a lot of you mentioned that there's things that you want to improve. Everybody wants to improve on their expansion process, but there might be things that are working now, and you want to make sure you hold on to those and lean into those. But what we want to do now is go into some of our slides from our CS operating model, which you can access on the Winning by Design website. And we put this together because for the whole right side of the bow tie, there was not an operating model to guide people on actions to take for the different phases of the bow tie. So onboarding, adoption, each have different elements to them, but for the expansion one, there's a few different things, and we're going to walk through these different blueprints that are part of the operating model. The first is an overall expansion process one, but then within the expansion process, there is white space planning, and I'll go into this in a second, but there's white space planning, strategic account planning, which includes stakeholder mapping, and expansion execution. So each one of those things is a blueprint. So what we're looking at right now is the overall expansion process one. Now, when we think about just the overall expansion process, these blueprints at Winning by Design are all very visual like this. And again, you can access this on the website, but what's important is to walk through and compare what you're doing, assuming you have some kind of overall process, and make sure that you're just having the different elements that are so critical in here. If we start from the left and go through the process, we map out the process of researching what's going on with a client and the different use cases available. I'll talk more in a minute about white space planning as a key step in expansion. But then we get into diagnosing and using SPICED, which is our framework that stands for situation, pain, impact, critical event, and decision. I'll go more into a couple of those things, but Jen talked about impact and pain and situation. SPICED will appear in almost all of our blueprints because it's so critical to what we consider to be the path to success for accounts. Once you do white space planning and diagnose, account planning is another step. And again, I'll go into the blueprint for that specifically. But as you work your way through this blueprint, you can understand that there's stakeholder mapping to happen, storytelling, perhaps a workshop, and then into expansion execution. So just when you think about the basics that are needed to have an expansion process, this is a fairly typical flow that we would expect to see. So going a little deeper into white space planning, which is the next slide, This is a pretty practical way to approach things. White space planning is probably one of the terms and expansion processes that we see the most gaps in. It's really not that complex of a concept. The idea is that you are looking at your clients, you are looking at the products or services that you have, you're looking at the pains that the different clients are feeling, what impacts they're looking for, and you're looking at your products to see which ones map. Not all of your products are going to be a fit for all of your clients, but the process of white space mapping is going to allow you to look critically at an account and see what the opportunities are that exist there. The two key elements to white space planning when you're thinking about it is really getting crisp on that impact. Is the impact that product A in this case here can deliver, does it align to the impacts that any of your clients are looking for? When we talk about critical event, this is another thing that's really going to help move the needle, and this will come up again in expansion execution. Critical event is going to be the thing that helps you drive a decision with a client. This is true on the acquisition side, and it's true on the renewal and the expansion side. A critical event is something that has a date, and if that date is missed, there is a negative consequence to it. I'll give you an example, and I'm actually going to use renewal. I know we're talking about expansion, but I'm going to use renewal just to illustrate the point. A renewal hopefully is a critical event. And if you are providing ongoing impact to a client, renewal will be a critical event, because if they choose not to renew, they will lose the impact that you are delivering. If you are not delivering ongoing impact to a client, then the renewal may just be a compelling event, meaning there is a date, but if you are not delivering impact, if they choose not to renew, they're not going to lose anything. So a compelling event has a date, but it's not going to be the thing that actually drives action. A critical event is. So you need to get an understanding of what critical events exist in your client's business. It could have to do with fiscal years. It could have to do with things happening in their industry, all sorts of different things. But impact and critical event are the two things in white space planning to really look carefully at. But again, just really making sure that you're mapping what the opportunities for expansion are across all of your clients. So in account planning, you can think of account planning as the way to approach executing against the white space opportunities that you've identified. So you use white space planning and you identify different expansion opportunities. And so now what you want to do is look at what's going on in the account, the history of what's happened, the things that are going on right now, and figure out how to have that expansion conversation in the context of all of those things. So you can see in this visual, we're looking at active projects and thinking in the context of those active projects, what is this, how does this impact their spend or their bandwidth or, critical events, all these kind of different things. Prioritization is really important. When we say priority, what we mean specifically is that what you have to deliver impact-wise to a client is a priority for their business. If we think about the things that facilitate a decision on a purchase, be it acquisition or an expansion, a lot of times we think about the availability of budget or the ROI story that you have. Those these days are table stakes. If you have something that's important to a client, they will find budget. SaaS software really lowered the bar on access, financially speaking. People can find budget if it's important enough to them. Every SaaS tool has an ROI story now, so that should just be table stakes. The really key differentiator is going to be priority. Is the impact that you can deliver something that's a top priority for their business right now or not? And if you're not sure, having that conversation with them is a critical step. As you go along the blueprint too, understanding how to navigate the organization, and we'll talk about stakeholder mapping in a second. Making sure the account plan is crisp, including if there's multiple people working with the account. How are you coordinating? How are you all playing together in the conversations to make sure that you're all helping drive things forward? So as you go through account planning, what you have is an account plan. You might have a template that everybody can use. It might be less formal than that, but the idea is that there is an account plan for all of your accounts. Can we go to the next slide? So when we think about stakeholder mapping, there's a few different ways that this can look. And the bigger the client is that you're working with, the more critical and the more expansive this can be. Obviously, if you have a very large client, like, I don't know, PepsiCo or like something huge, the stakeholder mapping and the org mapping in general can get really complex. It's important to know these things. The idea of stakeholder mapping is looking at the client organization, looking at all the roles and the people you're interacting with there, getting an understanding of each one's emotional pain, the rational pain, what KPIs are they being measured on, what is their role in the decision process, and how do they feel about your product, your services. This is so important because as you do this process of stakeholder mapping, not only can you get a good sense of how these different roles can be built into your account plan, including not just supporters, but anybody who can create obstacles. But also, if you're filling this out and you realize you have gaps in your knowledge, that becomes part of the account plan too, right? Is to learn, oh, we don't know who's in this role. We're not sure what this person thinks about us or what role they play in the decision process. So just going through this exercise can have a really great, it can really help direct your activities and the conversations that your team is having. Now, another way to look at it, this is an important step, but this other way to look at stakeholder assessment too, is looking then at each individual opportunity that you have. So by expansion opportunity, or we listed it out here by product, relative to each opportunity that you're thinking about, how do the stakeholders map in terms of level of seniority? Who are the executive stakeholders for a given product? Who are the senior ones? Who are the mid-level stakeholders? Who might your users be? So this is a good approach to take on top of the previous approach, especially if you do have a situation where it's a big client and there's going to be different stakeholders for different products that you have to offer. Sometimes all of your products will have the same stakeholders because your client organization is just not that big. But this can be another really useful way to look at stakeholder mapping. And then expansion execution is literally just the exercise of, okay, now that you have used white space mapping to identify the opportunities, you have developed a strategic account plan and your stakeholder mapping to know how to go after it, strategically speaking. What are the actual steps in your CRM and that you have mapped ideally in a playbook or something that the team member who owns expansion is following? The steps for an expansion execution could mirror your acquisition steps in your CRM, or they might be slightly different. But again, some things that are particularly important to note on here that we illustrate in the blueprint is certainly preparation. Again, spiced, you see in there all the time. The idea for spiced is that it rides along with every account for the life of the account. And you're using it as a way to continuously surface risks and opportunities and new information. You'll always see in blueprints like this one, the opportunity to summarize. Do not make assumptions that you know what a client is thinking, and just validate that you understand. Ask the questions, collect the information, summarize back, and have them assure you that that is in fact what they were saying. Prioritization again is on here, and as you move along the blueprint up to the top, a couple of really key points in expansion execution, and this holds true also for acquisition, is listening. You want to be talking less than the client. The more that you listen, the more opportunity you have to get useful information. And the other thing that's really useful is instead of thinking about it as negotiation, when you're talking about expansion or acquisition for that matter, think about it as trading. When we're kids, we all traded things most likely. I grew up in like the 70s and 80s. I had a sticker book and all the kids on the playground traded stickers. Some people traded marbles. Like, we do this instinctively. We know how to trade. And if you have that mindset, particularly if you have a role owning expansion or even renewal who maybe doesn't have the depth of commercial training that some other roles in the organization do, putting it in this mindset not only can make it more effective, but it can also make the conversations less intimidating for your team members. It's not about selling, it's about trading. It's about helping a client get impact. And then as you go down the blueprint, of course, once you agree on the trade and what the exchange is, just confirming and then working to close. So the expansion execution is literally just those steps to take to get the deal worked and to closed won. And the last thing that you'll notice, if you go to the website and pull the full operating model, we added a slide for account termination in our operating model, simply because it's a step that occasionally can get overlooked, and it's so important. Not only to make sure that if a client does terminate their contract with you, that you get them out of the systems that they're in and doing all those kind of things, but more importantly, if it's a deal that does fall in your ideal customer profile and they're churning out and that was unexpected, or you really did want to hang on to that deal, use it as an opportunity to understand why they churned. Was it something that about the product, about the service, about how impact was not achieved, or something else? Any and all information you can get about why an account terminates is going to be useful. So collect that information as much as you can and make sure that the information makes it to the proper teams within your organization. So that's why you'll notice an account termination step in our customer success operating model. All right. And now I believe David's going to jump in and talk about skills needed. Those are steps, and those blueprints can be useful, but there's skills needed to execute against those steps.
Yep, thanks, Beth. So as Beth said, you've identified your expansion process, and from there, the idea is to build out your playbook. Once you build out your playbook, you can go back and take a look at each of the steps in your specific plays, in your specific processes, and assess the skills that your team needs to have to run your plays effectively. If they don't have those skills, put in some training, identify some training, go find some training for not only the team members that are actually where the rubber meets the road in front of the customer, but also those frontline managers. If you train your account managers or your CSMs and you don't train their managers, then they don't have the ability to provide ongoing coaching to each of the team members. So you want to make sure you're training both and then giving your frontline managers the opportunity to provide continuous coaching to their team members. So as we look down along here, you'll see along the customer journey, there are a number of areas where there are blueprints that come into play that will highlight certain skills. How do I diagnose impact, or how do I diagnose pain in a customer meeting? How do I get from the customer what a critical event is? How do I navigate an organization, right? That's a real skill. If you're stuck on talking to a mid-level stakeholder and you need executive stakeholder buy-in to sign off on an expansion opportunity, you need to navigate that organization. You need to get to that executive key stakeholder in a way that makes sense, not for you, but for the executive key stakeholder. Do you know how to share a story? It's interesting. Companies don't necessarily remember what we did for them, but they remember how we made them feel. And when you tell a story to somebody, let's say somebody's faced with a yes or no on an expansion opportunity, and you tell them a story about another customer in a similar situation who had the same pain, who was trying to figure out the same problem, and they had a great experience, and you talk about how the expansion for them solved their pain point and put them on a much better path to achieve their goals, the customer is going to remember how that makes them feel. And then they're going to say, I want that same feeling, right? I may not care about the product, but I want that same feeling. So it's really, really good. And it's a real skill to be able to tell a story very quickly in a very compelling way. So let's, Jen, if you'll go down to the appendix for just a second. We have included in here a number of different blueprints for you that have different skills, and you can just scroll through a couple of these. So how to manage an effective meeting, how to diagnose and use SPICE, how to determine a critical event. There's a number of these in here. We're not going to go through all of them. When you get the deck, we'll send this deck out to everybody. You'll have a copy of these, but you can also go to Winning by Design's website and you can download all of the different blueprints that we have that help to determine skills. So with that, we're going to open up the floor for questions, and feel free to either put a question in the chat or come off mute and ask your question, and we'll see how we can help. Anybody want to start us off? Ben, go ahead.
So I was the one that answered, we've just changed things up, so it's kind of too soon to tell who owns what. And I think as an organization, we're in the process of like defining it. But amongst the group, I mean, who should own? I feel like expansion should 100% be AEs. But when we think about expansion alongside renewals, is it the group consensus that actually that whole process should kind of be managed and run by an AE across the entire client base? Or should that be like a client success person that's handling that? Does that muddy the waters?
Well, I will say, Ben, you might not even get complete consensus between Beth, Jen, and I, because I think everybody's got opinions. Beth, you want to start?
Sure. I think it depends, of course. There's a lot of different components, right? How complex is your renewal? How complex are your expansion motions? All that kind of thing. But here's what I will say is I've seen a lot of different organizations be successful with different structures of ownership for renewals and expansion and all that. The ones that I see struggle, though, are when a role is given tasks and they conflict. And I'll give you an example. If you have an AE that owns acquisitions and expansion, but the comp structure means that they're going to get paid more on their acquisition deals than on expansion deals, they're not going to give attention to expansion, and their expansion numbers won't be what they could otherwise be. Now, similarly, if you say, okay, we're going to give our CSMs renewals and expansion, which maybe they didn't own previously, because that way the AEs can focus on acquisition. I've seen people go this track, but then not provide the skills training needed for CSMs to have commercial discussions. And they've ended up being pretty good at renewals because they're talking more about something that already exists. But the idea of an expansion discussion, which is more of going through a buying process with the client and those kind of things, if they don't have the skills training, it's going to be hard to set them up for success. So this is why in the beginning we talk about it's less about who owns it and more about setting them up for success. Go ahead,
and there's some questions in here about what's the difference between an account manager and a CS. And what I've seen work is, so what happens is if you get to Beth's point, if you give expansion to AEs, they're also doing new deals. They can't focus. If you give it to CSMs, they're also trying to get the account to adopt and take best practices. So they can't focus. So either way, you're trying to split someone's head, right, and do the impossible. That's why what I've seen works better is when you do have a true account manager role, right? Now, whether that account manager reports to sales or to CS is kind of irrelevant, but that role is specifically focused on, my job is to get a renewal or get an expansion. And those are my numbers, and that's when I go and do it. And that means I have to work really closely with my CSM, and I might have to pull in sales to help out on it. But again, it's like that focus, right? If that's what I'm doing every day, I am waking up thinking, how can I renew? How can I expand? How can I renew? How can I expand? Not how can I renew and expand? And also there's this $4 million new deal that of course is going to get, all of my attention, right? And so it's all about that. Are you aligned so that you can, because we're all humans, right?
Right. And that checks out, I think, with kind of where we're going. So net new logo is completely separate to expansion, like in our world. So I oversee a team of named AEs, account executives, and renewals are seen as a critical event, and I thought it was good what you guys said about it's only compelling if there's no impact there. But that's seen as like a driving event for us to then drive expansion and growth, or obviously co-term and align everything. But the piece we're finding at the moment is we haven't clearly defined the role responsibility for the client success managers. So they're also focused on renewal as a key driver for them, but then we're missing that reoccurring impact, and the emphasis on that should be your job. You need to be in the weeds, just defining and guaranteeing that the clients are getting impact over and over and over again from our products.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we're moving, but we haven't fully.
Yeah, that's why if you can make some systems where it's like for the CS side, it's like make KPIs and goals around, are you getting to first impact? Where are you in the second impact? Where are you, so it's like, it's almost the leading indicators, right? But focusing CS folks on drive adoption, power users, get us, so that everybody's using it, and it tees up the conversation, right? So as soon as people start asking those questions about, is there something more? Why, yes. Let me introduce you to the AE, and it's a warm lead, and you get to go in there, right? Instead of having, CS folks who are trying to think through on a call, while I'm trying to get you to adopt, I'm also like, but man, my numbers are telling me that I really need to get you to expand by $20,000. And it's like a hard switch over to do that thing for it.
Yeah,
think-
and Ben, I was going to say, I'll add another dimension to this, which hasn't been talked about yet, and that's the dimension of the maturity of a company. In a lot of cases, when a company is really, really just kind of starting out, it's very common for their new logo sellers to also take on expansion. And I've even seen some accounts, in fact, I worked with some accounts last year where an AE that sells a new logo may own that account for the first 90 days or 6 months or even a year before handing off to CS, because they have a land and expand motion, and they're going to sell small, and then they're going to expand very quickly, and they want the AE to do that because they don't have an account management team. Maybe they don't even have a CS team at the time. And so they start with the account executive owning the new logo and the expansion, the renewal as well. And then as they grow and they start building the right side of the bow tie, the customer success organization, then they'll start to have a demarcation in there as to, no, now we want the AEs to own new logo sales, and we want the right side of the bow tie, a different team, call it CS, call it account management, call it whatever you want. They will own adoption, renewal, expansion, etc. The one thing I really dislike in the way some companies structure is, if there's an AE that's part of the sales team that's going to own expansion, they need to build in the ability to build relationships. What I really don't like, and what customers don't react well to, is someone that pops in and out of a relationship only when it's time for something to be sold, because then you really become a sales-centric organization, and it's very obvious to the customer that you're just there to sell them something and not solve a pain that they have. So if you're going to use someone from sales on the expansion side, they really need to be at least attending QBRs if you do them, EBRs if you do them. They need to be around and listening to the customer and building some sort of relationship so that they can be trusted when it's time to make that sale. I'm sorry, Beth, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was going to comment on, if you're thinking about, let's say you have account managers who are owning expansions, maybe renewals too, and then CSMs, and what do you have them focus on? This is one of the things I love about the spiced framework, because if the CSMs are really focused on making sure that they are always validating and updating the situation that a client is in, the pains that they're feeling, and the impacts, both rational and emotional, that they're looking for, and looking to identify critical events and any changes to decision-making people processes. If they focus on that and are constantly updating, they're going to find opportunities, they're going to surface risk, and they're going to get really deep knowledge that can even be fed to the product team, to the marketing team, to the sales team. And that gives them a framework. The thing that I can always identify if a CSM is being effective, if you look at a quarterly business review, assuming that your CSMs are delivering it, if the deck is all about your company and your product and updates to your features and all these kind of things, and there's not more of the focus on what's going on in the client's business, then that to me is a flag that maybe there's not as much impact-centric thinking going on.
And I think, and someone just had in there, Rishi, on the question on if you've got conversations are hard, if it's a current customer and it's a brazen price increase. And I think this goes back to a little bit what David was talking about. It's a hard conversation if that AM is not involved in the account at all, except for, hi, it's me, it's nice to meet you. Your price is going up by $10,000 for no other reason than it's just a price increase, is a hard conversation to have, right? And so it is having them in there where it's another part of the account is really critical, because then that conversation doesn't feel as forced, right? It's not an easy conversation for anyone to have if it's just a flat, increase. And so but making that a little bit easier if you've got some kind of relationship, their business, you're not just coming in with your hat in hand.
I will tell you what's even a harder conversation than just raising prices. And that's raising prices for the first time after you haven't raised prices for a number of years. I'm talking with a client right now that is in need of building an entire playbook just around conducting a price increase. They haven't done price increases in 9 years, not because they didn't need it, but they were literally afraid to have the conversation that you guys are talking about. And now they have to go back, and instead of maybe a 3 to 7% increase year over year because a new feature was put in here, more impact was delivered here, now they're looking at a 33 to 45% price increase without the ability to necessarily justify any new impact at this point in time. You want to talk about a tough conversation, they're in for some battles, and they're probably in for some increased churn at the same time. So be cautious of that.
Sure. Awesome.
Any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes left.
And I'll also put this up there for you.
Yeah. Does anybody want to share? So in the poll, one of the comments was that things are in flux and we're currently working to make significant changes. Does anybody that's making changes now want to talk about the types of changes you're making and what drove the decision to make those changes?
I don't necessarily want to be one of the main voices, but if no one else wants to answer, ours was largely driven by, I think we've had very stable gross churn numbers for the last 2 or 3 years, where we've now hit a bit of a plateau and they're not where they need to be, right? So we need to figure out a new motion to get those numbers down. And we also had a new SVP join us from a much larger organization, who's then bringing in a lot of best practice and shaking things up. And it is early days. We started literally January this year. But I personally think it's moving in a really positive direction. Like, we're just being a lot more strategic and can't even think of the word now, but we're just being very, very kind of prescripted, right, with how we're approaching certain scenarios to drive higher price increases when there's no product change, but also then tying in those expansion plays for new case studies, new use cases, to kind of continue to drive that impact with the client.
And I love that. I think it's the more you can be strategic and intentional and have, a plan that is repeatable that you can go through, the better, versus what we tend to see is the wild, wild west, right? Of everybody making it up, throwing things at the wall. Let's try this month. Now let's try this month. And this worked for this person, but not for this. So that's when it gets like exhausting and you can't figure out why does it sometimes work and sometimes not, versus when you do have a process. And to be clear, the first playbook or process you roll out may be a miserable flop, but at least you've got something that you can go through and say, it failed here. This didn't work well. We don't have the right skills here. We need to invest in coaching here, right? So giving you something that you can build on, because unless you're really good, you're not going to nail it the first time. But having that system where you can iterate and make those changes is really key.
Yeah, I think one thing that I appreciate you guys presented today was about coaching and how to help managers manage this, because if you think of putting together a renewal plan of this nature for every account, you do need someone who's singularly focused on driving renewals and the quality of the plan and the execution of the plan for renewal, you know, so that's a non-trivial activity, I think, that you have to be really committed to organizationally.
100%. And using data, you know, so, you know, to both of those points, you see what works and you learn from it. And you're going to have maybe somebody on the team who just hits on a talk track. That's great for some kind of activity. So make sure that you have a way to know what's working and leverage that across the whole team as well. Because it's always going to be iterative. Things are always going to be changing. The market's always changing. What people react to is always changing. So it's never going to be finished.
Yeah, and as Beth said, as the market changes, a company's pain may change. They may find pain in an area where they didn't have pain 3 months ago because of a change in the market. It could be a new competitor. It could be a downturn in the economy. It could be a lot of uncontrollable things like them that either solve a pain and it goes away or drives some new pain. So great. Well, we certainly appreciate your taking the time, your afternoon, your morning, your evening, wherever you happen to be. On this page, there are 2 QR codes. You're welcome to scan those with your telephone. One is to subscribe to our research newsletter, and the other one is to access our customer success operating model, which then gets you all of the blueprints in the operating model. They're both available on our website as well. And when you get this deck, there are a couple of LinkedIn codes, LinkedIn boxes that you'll see here. And you're welcome to follow Jocko, our founder, who promotes thought leadership all the time. Follow Winning by Design, who we do a lot of different posts on different topics, as well as Jen, Beth, and myself on LinkedIn. So thank you again for your time. We appreciate it and hope you have a great rest of your day and your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.